Hi. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of Winephabet Street. We are up to the letter W, and today we are going to be talking about Waitaki Valley in New Zealand, and we have two special guests with us. First, we have Dave Harlow, who was instrumental in getting this episode going. I was lucky enough to meet him at a wine event, and he has helped arrange for the samples. And he is from New Zealand Wine Navigator. So, hello, Dave. How are you?
Good. Nice to be here.
And we also have Jim Durham, who is the owner of Osler Wines from the Waitaki Valley in New Zealand. So, hi, Jim. How are you?
Hello, everybody.
All right. Can we take a minute or two each and give us a little bio about yourselves before we get into the nitty gritty? So, David, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. I am just an absolute wine enthusiast. I love wines from all over the world, but I especially love old world wines and New Zealand wines just because a lot of them use old world styles in making their wines, which is what I appreciate. My biggest passion is really teaching people about wine and the unfortunate, a lot of wines, domestic wines, the chemicals and things that are in domestic wines. So I really like, part of why I really like old world and New Zealand more than anything else. Clean wines.
Clean wine. Awesome. Thank you. And Jim, please introduce yourself.
Okay, guys. Well, I was an MD. I was a family practitioner until 18 years ago when we had started developing in a new region of New Zealand, the Waitaki Valley, which is in the same kind of general region as Central Otago, which you may have heard of, better known region. The Waitaki is still a tiny area, but it had limestone. My brother-in-law is one of New Zealand's great winemakers, Jeff Sinnott. He couldn't be with us today, but he said, he came down from working in Marlborough, which is like a 10-hour drive, and he came down with his family in the late 90s and said, take me to the Waitaki Valley. There's limestone there, and I want to do Pinot Noir on limestone. And that's kind of how it all started. And we pioneered in this little district and have kind of carved out a bit of a brand, really, with, I think, a fabulous Pinot Noir from the limestone. But we've also been looking after some other little vineyards in the valley, spaced over a sort of 20-mile stretch of the valley. A difficult climate, right on the cool edge. But when we get it right, as you'll see, it produces some pretty stunning wines. So I've dedicated my time. I gave up medicine, as I say, 18 years ago, because I felt you couldn't do both. And that's where we're at today.
Okay, beautiful. And Deb, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Debbie Gioquindo. I'm known as the Hudson Valley Wine Goddess. I'm a certified specialist of wine, a wine location specialist in port and champagne, and I just enrolled in a sherry specialist course. So that's TBA. I am author of a book, Tapping in the Hudson Valley, Day Trips and Weekend Itineraries to Visit the Hudson Valley Wine Region. And I'm co-owner of a restaurant in North Wildwood, New Jersey, called Trio North Wildwood, and that's where you can catch me Friday and Saturday nights till the end of the year. And I don't know if I missed anything, but if I did, Lori will tell me.
I think you hit it all today. I think so. And I am your co-host, Lori. My husband and I own Dracaena Wines in Paso Robles, and I am a UC Davis winemaking graduate. I am a WSET Level 2 certified, along with a champagne specialist, and currently I just graduated Rioja specialist. So I'm excited to be here because, well, we're going to start off with Riesling, and I am a huge Riesling fan, but we are going to be talking some Pinot also, and I cannot wait to get into this. So before we get going, we're going to listen to Elmo here. I hit every mute button there was for me tonight. Okay. All right. So welcome again, Dave and Jim. My first question has, before we even get into the Waitaki Valley, I was blown away, Jim, by the fact that the first thing on the website said about a sheep station in Southern Alps. So what is a sheep station? I'm assuming there's sheep involved, but what is it? What did you do with that? And
Sheep stations are a term in Australasia, actually in Australia and New Zealand, that was given by the early white pioneers who sort of took over large tracts of land, and sheep were brought out from Europe, and they started producing wool initially, and then with refrigeration in the 1880s, I think, the first shipments of frozen meat started going from New Zealand back to Britain. But it was really about the wool, and particularly merino wool. And a station in New Zealand usually, but not always, is in the mountains. There are some big stations that are on the coast. But generally in the South Island, you think of a sheep station with merino sheep, ultra fine wool of 16, 18 microns, beautiful wool, and usually large flocks. Our neighbour up the road, who actually sold us the land for one of our vineyards, has got 100,000 acres of beautiful mountain country, and he runs 30,000 merino sheep. They've just finished their annual harvest of that, which is the shearing of those sheep, and you're like 140 bales and 140 tons, I think, of fine merino wool.
oh my goodness, that must be something to see. I mean, oh my gosh.
Like quite a big operation, and it used to be all serviced with horses and then with four-wheel drives, and they still use both of those. But of course, he's an accomplished helicopter pilot, and they save a lot of time in locating all those sheep to bring them in for the muster them in for the shearing.
All right. I get taken aback by just certain things. I saw that on the website. I was like, okay, that's going to be my first question. Before we get into wine, I'm going to talk about sheep. So thank you. But now,
Spoil.
but before we get going, Deb, before we actually start into the Waitaki Valley, shall we do our virtual clink? So we are going to start with the Riesling. So this is the wine here. So it is Osler Lakeside Wines 2016 Riesling from the Waitaki Valley. So everybody's got their glass. We'll do our little virtual clink, and I will say slancha.
Slante.
So Lakeside Wines, what does that mean? That the vineyard?
So we look after 4 little vineyards. We have been looking after 4 little vineyards. The original limestone site that the Pinot Noir comes from, but also 20 miles further up the valley, slightly different climate, not limestone, on alluvial, grey-wacky kind of rocky ground. We planted Riesling and another one of our Pinot Gris from Alsace that we'd got. Oh. And this is the Pinot Gris from 2016. And both the wines today are from 2016, a special vintage. And Jeff will make the wines according to the grapes we give him. Of course, good winemaker, and he has that ability to see what's in that bunch of grapes and how he wants it to turn out. The relatively low acidity in that year. Riesling, of course, is a high acidity wine, but the relatively low acidity in 2016 meant that we could make a dry version. This is almost dry. I think it's like 8.5 grams residual sugar for 9 grams of acid. So it's almost dry. Those figures might be around the other way, actually. I should have checked.
It's you said 2016 was a special vintage. I think across the forward, it's like every region we talk to says 2016 was a special vintage. You know, Brunello is a
Okay.
special vintage. You know, what was so special for your region for 2016?
Our biggest challenge is springtime. We often get unfavourable winds that don't come the rest of the year in December when we're flowering, and that
Oh,
affects the fruit set a lot. We always get them ripe to a certain degree, but that year we had a really good conditions over flowering, so we got really good fruit set. But also, as the autumn progressed, we had really good, stable, dry weather for ripening, and so we got beautifully formed fruit that actually ripened evenly and beautifully.
it is lovely. It has the petrol that, you know, if you're doing a blind tasting, you know, that goes up to your nose, and you know.
First thing I did was note Petra. My
Yep.
husband loved this. He loved the Petra.
And
So
it's
it was a hot vintage, you said, correct? Was it a hot vintage?
Was it a hot vintage?
Yeah,
Yes.
hot growing
Yeah,
vintage.
relatively hot vintage. Yes, excuse me. It was. But combined with that, and we'll talk about it more when we look at the Pinot Noir, it was the evenness of the fruit set and the evenness of the ripening, and we managed to get it. I think we got this fruit to about 22 bricks. We use bricks as a measure of the sugar ripeness, and often it's less than that. It might be between 20 and 21. So the acid's a bit lower as well, and when the winemaker, I have this kind of vision of what makes a balanced wine, and I think it's a combination of the numbers and the science, but also of the dark art of winemaking. And I think Jeff's very good at getting that balance between the alcohol, the residual sugar, and the acid. And I have that image with the fruit in the middle, and I have that kind of image of an equilateral triangle with nothing sticking out particularly, fairly focused wine, and that lovely balance of acid that leaves a kind of lingering dryness for a wine that's not quite dry.
And I think that is a very difficult line with Riesling, is that you can have a higher residual sugar Riesling, but if the acid is there, you're not blown away by that sugar. And that's a talent to be able to walk that line between sugar and acidity and not go out of bounds in either direction. You know, it can be too acidic and it can be too sugary. It's that balance that really matters. And this definitely has it. I agree. I would say it is off dry. I wouldn't go to that. It's not a sweet one. The alcohol is 12.5. You know, so that does make it a little in the dangerous zone, because it's going to go down really, really nicely, and you're going to be pouring yourself another glass and another glass. But it's also a fuller bodied Riesling. And is this a typical Riesling for you? Is it vary by that vintage?
It does vary, but I think reasonable body is what we tend to get, and I don't know, but this concept of wines fattening up in bottle, and I think this wine has done that. It's gone from being a very focused, well, still focused, but it's gone from being a very tight, fine, white floral sort of wine to developing these secondary, tertiary characteristics that make Riesling one of the great wines, and it makes for superb food matching.
Absolutely.
I'm very sensitive to residual sugar, and this balance is so nice that I don't get residual sugar, tasting it.
The 2015, which you don't have, but it was much higher acidity that year, and we made a spat laser style, 33 grams residual, and about 10.5% alcohol, I think it was. And yeah, and it's delightful. It's even slightly more petrol. It's a year older, I guess, but very equally balanced. And you know, a minute after swallowing, you've got this incredible drying out of the palate. So it may start off, you don't get the cloying, you get an out of balance sweet wine.
Beautiful. And now, Dave, this might be a question easier for you to answer.
Mm-hmm.
Our number one fan of Winephabet Street is Michael Kelly, and his very first question, I will say, he sent both Debbie and myself an email. He lives in an area that is not very populated, but he's very willing to travel anywhere. And he traveled quite a distance to a couple of different stores looking for Osler wine to have tonight, and he was unsuccessful. So maybe if you can share, like in the chat or something, where he can possibly find it. If Michael, if you can put your zip code in, that might help Dave as he goes through. Or we can forward Michael's email to you. You know,
I actually already sent him my email and said he can contact me directly to get it.
Awesome.
And, oh yeah, I'll work with him.
I had somebody down here actually message me on Instagram wanting to, you know,
Lovely.
if the wines are sold around here. And I said, I have a hard time finding anything good around here.
Part of our issue is like Osler, we New Zealand Wine Navigator, we import 15 really small family-owned wineries, and Jim is one of them. And because the volumes are so small, it's hard for us to get into some stores and things like that. And typically, we're more popular in little restaurants and things like that are, you know, looking for some special wines. And but the best way to get it is to either contact me directly or just go to our website is probably the easiest way.
Perfect.
Which I'll share in the chat also.
Can we talk a little bit about the whole region? Because this is, you know, first that I've heard about it, and it's a fairly new wine region before, you know. So
it's pretty, sorry.
No, so people have an idea of where you are located and what makes it so special.
Yeah.
I mean,
do we have that map?
Yep. I will open the map.
So as she's opening it, what we would like to know is, like, where is it located? When the map comes up, we can do that. And we always want people to be able to come visit you. So, you know, what is the best way to get to the Waitaki Valley and the special things that make it that AVA?
So, no, you don't have to have a helicopter, but it's on the 45th parallel. We're just north of the 45th parallel, so we're halfway to the Antarctic from the equator, and we're getting into cool country. Remember, we don't have a big continental landmass behind us like California or Australia, so we tend to get what Kiwis know famously as 4 seasons in one day a lot of the year, and that makes it for significant challenges. But the Waitaki tends to be on the eastern side of our main mountain range, the Southern Alps. So it tends to be very dry, quite dry, not like some of California, but quite dry. Like we would say average maybe 14, 16 inches of rain a year in inches. And winters, which are getting warmer, a lot warmer in the last 10 years, but that's worldwide. And the spring's getting a bit earlier. And it's just from being very much on the edge, suddenly people are looking at the Waitaki and saying, hey, those guys are producing some kind of special, stylistically distinct wines. And maybe as the climate's warming up a bit, that's where we want to be. I don't know if you know of Atarangi, which is New Zealand's Grand Cru, really, Pinot Noir in the North Island in Martinborough. And Clive Payton, who is the doyen and who started it all, has said if he's not doing any more, but he said if he was starting again, he would now be doing it in the Waitaki. He's a big fan.
And you had mentioned limestone soils. Is that a small portion of the Waitaki Valley, or okay? So you've got a special spot.
geologically, New Zealand's from very unstable stock. New Zealand is caused by earthquakes. I mean, you've got those in California, but we're right on the tectonic plate between the Australian plate and the Pacific plate, and that forces up the South Island, particularly of New Zealand. So there's bits of old seabed, and that's what really drew us there. It's only 30 million years old, where the Caroline's Pinot Noir comes from, but there's also a variety of geologies within quite a short range. So the University of Otago sends its students up there because you can get igneous, you can get metamorphic, you can get sedimentary, all in a very small area. So yes, the limestone's quite a small part of it, actually.
And so you started to talk about, or maybe I missed it, the geographical aspect of it. So like in Paso, we have the Santa Lucia Mountains and the Shaloma Hills, and then we have the Salinas River in the center, and they all impact, what are your actual, do you have, you said you don't have the mountain range like Australia would have, but do you have your geographical influences?
Yeah, sure. We're on, there's quite a big river that drains the whole central part of the South Island. It stores like 65% of New Zealand's hydropower, and there are multiple hydroelectric schemes along its length. And that comes down between two mountain ranges, and we're just on the edge of that. And on the southern side of the river, looking north, so that we get all the aspects of, we need a bit of slope to capture the sun. They say 1% of slope is 1 degree of slope is 1% more accumulated heat for the season, and we've needed all of that. But we have mountains behind us, and we look to the north. Of course, the sun's in the north where we are. So, yeah, it's quite spectacular. It's quite special.
Talk about the climate. What type of climate do you have?
So the climate it's a temperate climate. As I say, 16 inches of rain. We get temperatures up to, well, we're in centigrade. We get temperatures up to kind of 100 degrees at times in January, our hottest month. And we get down to where we are not very cold, down to about -6 maybe centigrade. So that's what, I'm
trying to do the math.
yeah. So maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that in the winter.
Are you guys seeing the slide presentation?
I'm just seeing this black circle.
Yes, so am I.
Yeah, it's trying to load.
Yes.
And I can't get rid of the black circle.
So I'm sorry, Jim. What did you say your high temperature is?
So maybe we get a few days where it touches 100 degrees.
Okay, Fahrenheit. Okay.
But that's got a little bit more common, of course. But mostly the temperature would be more like I think our average temperature is only 20 degrees in summer, like in January. So I'm just trying to work out what 20 degrees is, but 70 degrees Fahrenheit maybe.
Yeah, so 20 centigrade.
Lots of sun, and we also get a maritime influence. So as the hinterland inland from us up the valley further heats up, there's quite a big plain inland from us. That heats up and it sucks up a sea breeze, an adiabatic wind in the summer, every day, sort of early afternoon, and that tends to bring a bit of cloud sometimes and a bit of dampness, but generally it's pretty dry.
And then do you have to worry about mold or mildew, or I'm sorry,
disease pressure is not high on our vineyards.
Okay.
We have to a wee bit, but nothing like they would in other, like in Marlborough, they have to a bit of it. In the North Island, there's a lot more humidity, a lot more rainfall, and they certainly have to counteract it more vigorously than we do.
Okay. And I'm sorry, Deb, you're not able to stop that from...
I'm trying to get the whole thing.
Okay. Can you tell us, Jim, like the history of winemaking in the Waitaki Valley? Like when did the vines first start coming in, and when did it start to develop a little more?
Yeah, well, it's very recent. As I was telling you, in the late 90s, I met my new brother-in-law, who turned out to be this hot winemaker, he really is, and a walking encyclopedia. And as an MD, I'd been farming on a sheep station, which you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
When I was a young medical student, and flying the planes and driving the cattle down the lake in the barge, and acting as what's called a rouseabout, doing general tasks. And I was always hankered to be a bit of a farmer. I did a good medical career, but when I met Jeff, he said, "Take me to the Waitaki Valley. I'd like to have a look at it." There was no industry there. So that's the end of the 90s. We bought our bit of land in 2001 and planted it first in 2002. So we were, along with a couple of other people who arrived at the same time, we were pioneers there. It's still absolutely tiny, but we're starting to make a bit of a mark, really. Only a few producers, some of the Marlborough producers, some of the Central Otago producers have vineyards there now. But we've been there doing it, and we don't make the grapes actually in the valley. I truck them out to contract winery where Jeff oversees their making.
Oh, okay. Okay. And how far are you trucking that?
2 hours.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
2
I'm
hours
guessing
over-
you're harvesting very early in the morning.
No, it's cool enough when we harvest that we take the previous day's harvest, and I drive them over at dawn the next morning.
Oh, okay.
And there may have been a frost, or there may have been certainly cool temperatures overnight, so that the fruit's kept in great condition. And sort of 12 hours, when it was last picked before we get it into the vats.
Awesome. And then what is your, I don't know if you guys follow the same thing. Do you have the Winkler scale for the degree days that you have? That might be an American thing.
The growing degree days?
Yes.
I don't know about the name Winkler, but it's quite low. Like we're between 800 and 900 growing degree days.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's quite cool. We have to work it, and we get low crops to get them really physiologically ripe, which we successfully do. But also, interestingly, by not ripening as fast as Central Otago, which has a much more continental climate than we do, I think that maritime mediating of temperatures that we get gives us an opportunity to get real skin ripeness as well as sugar ripeness. And I think that's one of our little secrets. But we also get great acidity in the wines from the diurnal variation in temperature at that time of year. So we get great acidity, and I think that's what gives these wines great longevity they'll last a long time, and some rather special style characters that is not seen elsewhere in New Zealand.
Deb, do you have a question? I'm hogging him.
No, and I'm sitting here trying to get this to stop spinning, and it won't. I'm at a loss.
What happened if I did screen share? I was going to see if I could share my screen that has the map on it already.
Okay.
I'll try.
Because I had to convert it from a JPEG to a PDF. And then I put it up, and then it just...
Oh, there we go. Yay!
Oh, you did it. Oh, you did it, David. Well done.
Okay.
Oh,
that was me. All right. Off.
So I like that because it shows. Is it still showing?
Now
it's gone.
We're back to the way it was.
Okay. Let me...
I'll stay out of it. I was just trying to find something myself.
Let me do reshare again here. Window.
To show the region.
There it is.
Here we go. There we go.
Okay.
Now, can you see my pointer? No.
No, but I can. If you tell me what to point at, I can point at it.
Well, you can see Waitaki there, right down
There's
Central
Waitaki.
Otago. Central
Right.
Otago, right in as far south and as in the centre there, has got the more surrounded by mountains, quite famous for its Pinot Noir, I think, worldwide. Big fruity wines because they get this rapid ripening, quite high alcohol. They're learning to manage that. But here in the Waitaki, we're 2 hours over the hill and more coastal, as you can see. And that gives us a very different climate and a very different style of wine to Central Otago. In addition, we have this little bit of limestone that is not found in many other places in New Zealand. There's a little bit in Canterbury Wairarapa. There's a tiny little bit of Canterbury Waipara, and there's a little bit of limestone in Wairarapa in the North Island there, you can see. Those are the main sort of regions of New Zealand. And we're really a little pimple on the Otago scene, if you like.
And
And I'd like to think we're punching above our weight.
And you're
Sorry?
fairly new. You're fairly new. You planted in what, 2002 or something like that?
Yes, we did.
So I mean, these wines are like stellar. Or I haven't tried the Pinot yet, but what else? I mean, we have the Riesling and we have the Pinot Noir. What else grows very well in this region?
Well, it's not that popular in the US, I believe, but we do a couple of stellar Pinot Gris of different styles.
Oh, there Pinot
When-
Gris is starting to come.
Yes.
People are finding their way to Pinot Gris.
Well, there's some stock of ours still that David's got there in the warehouse that's got a few years on it, and it's spectacular. I really recommend it. The Lakeside Pinot Gris, the accompaniment to this Riesling.
Yeah, 2012.
Yeah, and it's really good. I had some the other day.
Spectacular.
But
So
we also do sorry.
is Lakeside the vineyard that it comes from?
Yep.
Yes.
So that's the most inward, further up the valley vineyard where we live, beside one of the first hydro lake that you meet when you're going up the valley. And just as a point of interest, it's a very low population, this area. It's not even well known in New Zealand. There are quite a lot of holiday makers now come to these hydro lakes in summer. But it is also, there's a very famous New Zealand rugby player that comes from our town called Kurau, where our cellar door is. And the very famous rugby player is known as the GOAT, the greatest of all time of rugby players, Richie McCaw. So in New Zealand, that's why Kurau is now on the map. But the other reason that is actually more interesting even, that the very first hydroelectric dam in the region was a job creation scheme by the government in the Depression. And they built the whole dam across this big river. It's quite a big river. They built it completely from labour, wheelbarrows, pulleys, no machinery, to create as many jobs as possible. And there were very cold winters at that time, and these men were living in shacks and tented huts and pretty bad conditions. And the local doctor, Macmillan, and the headmaster, Davidson, and the Presbyterian minister, Nordmeyer, started having meetings about these terrible social conditions. There was quite a high attrition rate. They were getting injured, dying, getting sick. 2,000 men working on the dam. They had secret meetings with the only, I was going to say pink, but it's the other way around for Republicans and Democrats, the only sort of socially minded farmer in the district, because these farmers tend to be very Republican in their thinking. And they had secret meetings to discuss all these things. And as a result, the first Labour government, the socialist government in New Zealand in 1937, was formed. And two of these guys, the doctor and the minister, became ministers in the government of that first Labour government and formed the world's first social welfare policy. There you go. Cradle to grave with state involvement. And
Wow.
that's been modified a lot in New Zealand over the years, but it's still very much part of what makes New Zealand a bit special, and the recognition that for a democracy you need both sides.
Absolutely. And before we went live, you were telling a story of the Waitaki, where the name itself comes from, and the history of
So
that?
yes,
Can you go
yes.
into
So our
that?
mountain. So if you're a Maori person and in a formal setting, you give your mihi, which means you say you are where you come from, really. So you talk about your mountain and your river, and in our case, our mountain is New Zealand's highest mountain in the Southern Alps, about 150 kilometres away, 100 miles away up the valley. And it's a mountain that's 12,500 feet high. And it's called Aoraki, Mount Cook, depending on the name you want. Aoraki means cloud piercer in Maori. And the glaciers and rivers that come off that mountain form the start of the Waitaki River. And Waitaki Wai means water or tears. And so the interpretation of Waitaki can be, there are a number actually, the tears of Aoraki, the mountain. So that's the water that we take for a little bit of irrigation is the tears of Aoraki. So we're very much the Waitaki.
I love that. I love that.
Do you want me to put it? I have this map to show if this helps.
Yes, indeed. So you can see that blue lake up there, and just off the scale by, there's a green icon. Just up there is Mount Cook, right in the middle of that mountain range that stretches up the island.
Okay.
And the Tasman River comes down into Lake Pukaki, the turquoise lake. There are actually two others you can see in different colour that don't have that glacial coloration. And they all form down into one river that comes down, and you can see a yellow dot coming down towards the coast. That's Kurau, and that's just where we are in the middle. That's our vineyards are on either side of that yellow dot.
Wow.
And as you can see, it's quite mountainous there.
Yes, it is. It certainly is. Wow.
Yeah, this gives a lot better view of what you're looking at when you're talking about a wine region in this area.
And right up in the top, just out of sight in the top right corner, where that peninsula is sticking out, just above that is Christchurch, the city of Christchurch, famous for, it's one of New Zealand's biggest cities, famous for the earthquake in 2012, the earthquakes. And right down towards the bottom left, you can see a zigzag-shaped lake where I am today. Actually, you can see a yellow dot on that, and that's Queenstown, and it's a well-known tourist town.
The yellow dot is Fergburger.
What?
The yellow dot is Fergburger.
Fergburger, is it? Okay, well, Fergburger is a very well-known burger joint in Queenstown. And people come from miles around to go to Fergburger, yeah. But that's in the middle of the town.
That's your version of In-N-Out then.
Yes. So between those two dots is central Otago, and then over the mountains into the Waitaki. That gives you can see we're not really, it's Waitaki North Otago, that's officially is our geographic descriptor, but actually we're more to the east of central Otago rather than north of it.
Okay. And so let's talk a little bit more about your winery itself. So Osler, the label has a shell on it.
Yeah.
So can you tell us the meaning behind the name and behind the label?
I'd love to. You start off on a blank canvas and you try and decide where you're going to pioneer and do something as silly as starting to be the first people to grow grapes there. And you then have to create a brand, and you come from being a fairly single-minded MD. You're breaking new ground all the way. And my mother's, who died a very long time ago, his name was Audrey Osler. One of our wines is called Audrey's Pinot Gris, and it's our primo white. She died in 1960, and it turns out that only her grandfather, 3 generations back, his name was Osler. My mother's name was Audrey Osler. And he came from Yorkshire on that northeast coast, and all the Oslers around the world. In fact, when we started this project and got our first wines out, there was a Jim Osler who turned out to be the chairman of wine judges in Canada who contacted me. But all those Oslers spread out around the world, as the Brits did when they, and in old England, the Oslers were people that looked after the horses at the inns. They were the stablemen. And I always thought it was funny that they came from Yorkshire and it wasn't really an old English name. And it took me a while to work out that actually York was Jorvik. It was a Scandinavian, it was a Viking town. Oh. And in the 10th century, the Vikings all arrived there. And they found a lot of archaeological stuff. And a lot of those Vikings were great horsemen, of course. And I've no doubt that if you put an umlaut over the O of Oslo, it would be Östler, the people from the east. So I kind of fancy myself these days, and it's given me a whole new confidence in life. But there'll be no pillaging going on. Yeah, so that was the brand, and so that was the name, and you wonder how that's going to go, and it's become a little bit of an icon, I have to say. And the shell was, how do you represent limestone on a label? Because Jeff really wanted to make Pinot Noir on limestone. That was going to be our point of difference, and it is our point of difference with that Carolines. Not all our wines are from that limestone site, but the Carolines and the Audreys are, and we think it's given it the combination of climate and that geology are the chief parameters, I think, that give it the terroir its distinct nature and style. So when we ripped the site with a bulldozer prior to planting it, we pulled up all sorts of limestone boulders, and what drew Jeff to the site was there was this big limestone cap. When we looked up from the valley floor, there was this big limestone cap on a hill. He said, "Take me up that road," and we came over the brow, and there in front of us was a mini Côte d'Or, he reckoned. And in the centre of that, just above where the vineyard is, there was a quarry where in the 1960s they'd looked for agricultural lime. So we could go and look at the profile of the soil and the subsoil. And Jeff got very excited, and after 2 years of so-called due diligence, we were going to do it come hell or high water. And that's the story. Due diligence and mapping and trying to produce a model of the climate, because there wasn't much to go by, gave us a wildly optimistic kind of shot of what, in fact, the temperatures are. And really, you shouldn't be able to grow grapes where it's that cold. I think partly, and we now know that the high UV levels and the hole over the Antarctic, the UV hole, has given us UV levels that help compensate for heat a little bit. It is also getting warmer. There's no doubt about it. The last decade, we've seen earlier and earlier vintages. Yeah, so that's most of the story, really.
You talked about Caroline and Audrey. Are they your children, grandchildren?
Right.
Audrey's the mother, right?
So Audrey was my mother. Okay. I was just going to say that when the bulldozer ripped that land, that we pulled up these big limestone eggs that had rolled off the cap, the limestone cap that we saw that first day, and those were all pulled out. And we spent ages collecting them and piling. And several years later, a gentleman in his 73rd year spent a year building them into a rock wall. So we now call that vineyard Clos Osler, because it's very Burgundian in appearance. And it's fabulous. It's kind of a special thing, really. And one of those boulders, when they were broken open by the rock breaker to make the wall, we started finding these fossils. Just down the road, they found a meter-high fossil of a penguin.
Oh my gosh!
And precursors of whales that, 30 million years old, and that shell is 30 million year old fossil.
Wow, that is so cool. That is so cool. When you go ahead.
Sorry.
I was just going to ask, when you decided to plant there, how did you decide, you wanted Pinot. How did you decide that I'm assuming that was the first thing you planted was the Pinot?
Absolutely.
All right. And how did you decide, what clones you were going to use, or are they on self root? How did you decide what was best for that area? If you were the pioneer, people are going to learn from your mistakes. How did you eliminate
luckily
mistakes?
I teamed up with a very experienced winemaker and viticulturist.
Okay.
And he made the guesses for a lot of it, and we didn't get much wrong, There's a couple of the clones that he selected. We planted them over 3 years, and a couple of them don't do that well in our cool climate. But some of them do particularly well. And so we took a selection of clones on a selection of rootstocks, and the very first vines we had taken from a nursery that were on their own roots. But that year that we planted, the first phylloxera was found in central Otago. So we thought we won't plant any more on own roots. We haven't had any problems with that so far, and those vines actually produce some very nice grapes. But I think you wouldn't plant on own roots anymore in New Zealand, really. Clones. The clones are mostly the Burgundy clones and UCD clones. So we've got the Pommard clone, UCD 5 and 6. And we've got B115, B667, B777. And then we've also got this gumboot clone. I don't know if you know what a gumboot is. It's like Wellington, wellies. I don't know what you call them.
Oh, okay. I have a pair of wellies.
Yeah. And there's a lovely story. It's also known as the Atarangi clone. I mentioned Atarangi as being the Grand Cru of New Zealand. So the Atarangi, Clive Payton was working with a horticultural advisor in a government research station in the late 70s when he was on duty actually at Auckland Airport when a chap arrived from France with a suitcase bulging, and he was asked to display it. And we've got very tight biosecurity in New Zealand. And this guy, Malcolm Abel, opened the suitcase and found stuffed in a Wellington and his gumboots were cuttings from a Burgundy vineyard.
Uh-oh.
Now, there's a lot of that in California because you don't have that kind of barrier that we have, biosecurity barrier. And suitcase clones, as they're called, are all over California, I gather.
Yep.
But in New Zealand, there are only a relatively small number of clones, and then there are not many more coming in. So anyway, the story is that these came from La Tâche, and somehow he was able to, as a government, this was not corrupt, he was actually able to take them away and quarantine them officially. And he grew them on, and his assistant, who was Clive Payton, who started Atarangi the following year, planted that. And that's quite a large part of our planting. It's quite a vigorous producer. So those Burgundy clones are pretty low yielding, and because of our climate, we're even lower yield. So we would only get, in a good year, 4 tons to the hectare.
Oh.
So that is like 1.5 tons to the acre.
Acre, right.
So and that's because of this cool spring we get and the fruit set we get. Now, because of that, in 2004, Jeff said we better plant some white, and I thought we're going to be Burgundian here. We're going to do a Chardonnay. But at that stage, the clones in New Zealand that were available were mostly Mendoza, and they would not set fruit in our climate. And besides that, everyone was a bit sick of overproduced Chardonnays. And Jeff said, no, let's do a Pinot Gris. It's pretty popular. And I was disappointed, and I still am really. I really would love to have, I think if you look at that Caroline's, and I think we could do something pretty spectacular with a Chardonnay. I haven't done it, and it would be a bucket list wish. But we make our Audrey's Pinot Gris like a Chardonnay, and we stick it in a Burgundy bottle for that reason.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Deb, do you have another question, or?
I do. And this is going back into the weather and stuff. Do you have to worry about the frost?
Yes. We worry about everything, Debbie.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, yes.
I mean, just with the way your climate is, and
Yeah.
have you lost any? Have you had any bad years where frost is really impacted?
Yes, we've had years we didn't produce.
Ugh.
And the climate's definitely improved, but of course we're getting more of these extreme events as well around the world, and we've had our share of those. But spring frosts are a real problem, real problem. We used helicopters for years because we were always undercapitalized, and we didn't put in the permanent wind fans that we now have. And I had the worst nights of my life monitoring the temperatures remotely, sitting on my laptop with a weather station giving me real-time readouts after the alarm went off, sort of 3 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And you'd watch the graph slowly edging downwards. And I'd have a helicopter on standby 15 minutes from the vineyard, and the pilot even sitting in the cockpit of the aircraft, and then I'd say, no, don't go, there's another puff of wind, and they'd get pretty pissed, really. And then I'd say, yes, look, the temperature's dropped, and please fly. And I'd get in my car and race down to the vineyard at the same time, and we have these temperature-sensitive lights, and they're all flashing red by that stage, which is like -1, Celsius, which is about as low as we can possibly go. And the helicopter arrives immediately and starts hovering and around the vineyard and bringing down the temperature inversion, the warm air. And we always left it as late as possible because it costs so much per hour to fly these things. Having put in permanent structures in 2014, we bit the bullet and financed them, and they come on automatically at about +2 degrees. So we burn a bit more diesel, but they're a fraction of the cost to run. And I think we've seen overall the ambient temperature doesn't get as low during the spring, and we get better fruit set. It's just a matter of doing it really and financing it.
Right.
So yes, frosts have been a big issue for us. As I say, we've had just about everything. We certainly have droughts, but we have water, the irrigation that we can counteract that. We've had floods. We get extreme winds at times coming down through the Alps.
Wow.
And we get frosts. We've had big snow. The last one of those was really in 2006. So we haven't seen that for a while, but touch wood, who knows?
So I guess all of that, I had read that NewZealandWine.com stated that Waitaki Valley is the wine growing region that is on the edge, and there's little margin for error. I'm guessing all of that is the reason why they call it that. Is that?
Well, they used to call, there were books written about Central Otago who preceded us as the winemaking on the edge. I think you could say we're just over the edge, but it's getting more reliable, and I think that being on that edge is partly what gives the quality of these wines. And I think there's a feature in all the wines of, I don't know how you describe minerality, but there is certainly a sort of chalky minerality that comes through in the limestone ones. But I think part of that's climate and that acid thing, because we can see it in these whites as well. I think you could imagine you get a little bit of saltiness in that Riesling.
Right.
So right now you're heading into spring, correct?
Yep. Yeah, we're in the middle of spring. Yeah.
How is it going right now?
It's been a cool spring. So last year was the earliest year we'd had. This year we've really gone back quite a bit. There's been some frosts in some areas. The Waitaki's been okay. So often we get them before, worse than everywhere else. We thought when we went there we'd be better than Central Otago because we're more of a maritime climate. It turns out we're probably a bit worse for frosts. They warm up a bit quicker in the spring than we do. But there's been frosts in Marlborough, been frosts in Waipara and North Canterbury that have done quite a lot of damage, I've heard, but we're okay at the moment. The full moon at the start of, closest to the start of November often is our worst week.
There's.
Okay.
The shoots, when the shoots are about this long and tender and vulnerable and can be very easily taken right off in in half an hour.
Right.
When is normal? Would you say is the normal time for bud break? About when?
So this year we've only been burst really for a week.
Okay.
But we'd normally say the start of October.
Is bud. Wow. Okay. Right. And then that's a dangerous time too. Depending on, But
right from then on, I mean, any frost is a disaster.
Is a disaster
if it's not ameliorated.
Yes, we actually had a little bit of frost. We had one night in Paso that it dropped in, and we lost a lot of vines. It's horrible, but I would love. Deb's got the bottle in her hand, so she's thinking exactly what I'm thinking.
I think we're approaching up on 9 o'clock, and we haven't really spoken about the Pinot Noir. And
okay,
this has been the most lovely Pinot Noir I've had ever from New Zealand, to be perfectly honest with you. It is just...
Thank you, Debbie. It's a very special wine.
It is got wonderful nuances of fruit, a little bit of acidity. I mean,
it's got it all, hasn't it?
It does. And it does. When you said minerality, that was why I was pointing at the glass. You can taste that limestone. You can taste that chalkiness in there. And I do enjoy Pinots, and for us, California Pinots are usually like cherry bombs, and that's another delicate line to cross. But this has the cherry in it, but it's not that cherry bomb, and it's an in-depth fruit going on. It's not just that cherry in your face. There's the red fruit, there is some dark fruit, there's that chalkiness. It's lovely.
And there's a bit of tertiary development happening. This wine will last for years. There's a bit of tertiary developing there, and I can imagine a little bit of forest flora, a little bit of truffle, a little bit of chocolate.
It's just elegant.
Yeah.
It's quite a big wine. So the story of 2016 in the Clos Osler was we got this perfect fruit set, and I suppose you know that the name Pinot they think derives from pine cone, so that the Pinot bunch, the Pinot Noir bunch, tends to be pine cone shaped. And that year we got a perfect fruit set. Often we don't get the two seeds forming, so they're not fertilized that well. That year we got perfect bunches forming of berries that never grew. So instead of being 12 millimeters, what's that, half an inch in diameter when they're at harvest, they would but only be sort of 9 millimeters. Now, as you'll know that, and they never filled out, and quite a lot of them didn't have two seeds in them. But we also had a superb autumn, as I said, so we got beautiful ripeness of these beautiful little bunches. It got a bit riper than I think I would have chosen, but Jeff's he makes the call on that, and have to say he thinks he's won best wine for another Pinot Noir, best wine and show in San Francisco. He's won best Pinot Noir in the world and the IWC in London, and he knows his stuff, and he thinks this 2016 Caroline's is the best Pinot Noir he's ever made.
Oh my God.
It's beautiful. It really is beautiful.
It's over 14%. It's a bit bigger than my favorite, because some of ours are much finer than this, and there's a big seasonal variation. We celebrate vintage variation, but if you like big Pinots, which are almost Syrah-like, obviously in flavor very different, but in terms of density, then this is the one for you.
It is beautiful.
I'm in love with it.
It is beautiful.
Yeah.
And I just one last question, and then we will let you go. Or I have one last question. Debbie may have one last question also. Just what is your case production?
So of that 2016, I think there were 1,200 dozen.
Oh, okay. Okay.
They're
And
pretty
is that
small.
about where you stand?
Yeah, we've had
Okay.
a bit more. We've certainly had a lot less, and as I said, we've had a year where we didn't get anything.
Oh, right.
Hopefully not again, but that equates to about 3.5 tons per hectare. Well, my ideal would be to be producing regularly 4 tons per hectare.
Okay.
And I think that's about as much as you'd want to load those vines in our climate. We have quite a big canopy for each plant. So if you measure the exposed leaf area to fruit weight ratio, was all calculated before we started. We need quite a lot of leaf.
Okay.
And in other places, like in central Otago, where they ripen too quickly, they're reducing the size of their canopy. But we need it all. And so small yields to get very physiologically and sugar ripe is our mantra, really, and relatively late in the season usually. We don't harvest until mostly the end of April.
Okay. So they're on there a long time. They're on there. They're
Long
happily.
hang time.
They
Yes.
are very happy on that vine. Yes.
Mm.
Very
Now,
nice.
If people wanted to come visit you, if they're traveling to New Zealand, how do they get
To you.
So most people who come to New Zealand travel between Christchurch and Queenstown by road usually. And not far off that main road, you can get down to Kurau in the Waitaki Valley where we are. But we have a website and we have a cellar door, and the old post office that goes from that time of the Depression is our cellar door.
Oh, wow.
Old limestone building. So it's worth if someone's making the journey. Especially, I had a guy from California some years ago who had found some Carolines and just fell in love with it, and he had a dozen Screaming Eagle from some special vintage worth megabucks. He told me he sold them for 23,000, is it US or something?
Cool.
And with that, he flew out to New Zealand and came and saw us.
Oh,
that
that
was
is so
pretty
awesome.
special.
Oh my goodness.
That is so awesome.
Yeah. So
Jen?
we're not hard to find if you just follow that. It's on our website.
And I know you said your distribution is limited, but are you available on the East Coast as well?
Dave.
Dave?
We're actually working on that. We actually do have some distribution in Florida now, and so that does cover the Southeast, but we're working on getting a little bit better back. Since COVID, we kind of lost our Northeast distribution, but you could always contact me if somebody needed to, and I did put my information in the chat if anybody needs it. But we've improved our website to make it more accessible so that everybody can access the website, and we ship to 39 states, so we can definitely do that. But we will have distribution back in the Northeast again as well for trade, as well.
Beautiful.
Okay, good.
So I would like to thank both of you for coming on, and for Jim for taking your time. You're tomorrow morning, right?
Yes.
No, we're yesterday afternoon actually.
Oh.
No, you're tomorrow. We're yesterday afternoon.
Oh, we're yesterday. Okay.
On the East Coast, we got the West Coast, and we've got down under.
Yeah.
Because of the
2 o'clock in the
dateline,
afternoon
if you go all the way back round, we're I think 20 hours ahead of you, but you're actually 4 hours ahead of us at the moment in terms of daylight time.
Oh.
Yes.
It gets so confusing. But whatever day it is, whatever time it
Wherever
is.
you are.
Thank you so much for coming on.
you.
Your wines are incredible.
Stellar.
They truly are. And I can't wait for our listeners to hear the podcast, to hear about Osler wines. And Dave, thank you so much for the time you spent with us today, and also arranging for the samples and getting Jim here. And for those of you who I went to Dave and I suggested another region, And Dave's like, no, this is the region
Waitaki.
you want. Yep.
And
And
I'm so glad because the exposure for this wine region, and it's new and stellar wines. I mean,
yes,
incredible.
exceptional wines. So double thumbs up. Kudos, Dave, for switching me off the track I originally was going on. Thank you very much. And we appreciate it. And all of the listeners and viewers, any questions, please send them over to us and we will forward them to the correct place because you're going to want to get your hands on these wines because they are outrageous.
These are stellar. I mean,
Yes.
and I have to say, this is probably the first Riesling I've ever had from New Zealand.
I think me too. I'm not
But
familiar with
this
a
Pinot
memory of one.
This
So-
Pinot Noir, they're both. I don't know which one to pour in the glass next, you know, because it's 9 o'clock. My team's playing football. Football. So I don't know. I'm gonna go into it.
There you go.
Wonderful.
But
Thank you all very much.
so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.
Have
Thanks,
a
guys.
great night.
Bye now.
Slanta.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.